When the war was raging across Europe, few German soldiers could imagine that their path would ever lead them to the United States. For many, capture seemed like the end of dignity, and the thought of crossing the Atlantic as a prisoner was unthinkable. Yet between 1942 and 1945, almost 425,000 German prisoners of war were transported to America. Their journey from the battlefields of North Africa and Europe to the quiet towns of the U.S. became one of the most unusual chapters of World War II. It began with surrender. In North Africa, during the campaigns against General Rommel's Afrika Korps, thousands of German troops were surrounded and forced to lay down their weapons. Exhausted, sunburned, and hungry, many thought they would be executed on the spot or chained and marched endlessly across deserts. Instead, they were loaded onto Allied ships, guarded but not mistreated, and told they would be transported to detention camps. What they did not know was that their final destination would be thousands of miles away, across an ocean in a country many had never even seen on a map before. The Atlantic crossing was a shock in itself. Packed into troop ships, the prisoners spent weeks at sea. At first, they were terrified of U-boat attacks, fearing that their own navy would torpedo the ships and kill them all. Some whispered that this was punishment enough to be destroyed by their own side. But the convoys made it safely, and when the German prisoners finally stepped onto American soil, the silence stunned them. For men who had grown used to the bombed-out cities of Europe, the calm harbors and busy American docks looked surreal. There were no air raid sirens, no ruins, no collapsed buildings. Instead, they saw ordinary people going about their lives, trucks delivering food, workers unloading cargo, children playing along the water. The prisoners were herded into trains guarded by American soldiers, but still no chains. Some muttered in disbelief. Others stared quietly out of the windows as the countryside rolled past. The train journeys carried them deep into the heartland of America. Camps were built in remote areas, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, but often located near small towns. For local Americans, seeing German prisoners in their neighborhoods was strange, even unsettling at first. Rumors spread that these men were dangerous, loyal Nazis who might cause trouble. But when the trains arrived, what stepped out were not terrifying monsters, but young men, many barely out of their teens, exhausted and bewildered. The first impression the Germans had of their captivity was one of surprise. They had been told by Nazi propaganda that capture by the Allies would mean cruelty, starvation, and abuse. They expected to be beaten, chained, and treated like animals. Instead, they were lined up, counted, and marched into orderly camps where food was already waiting. They were given uniforms marked PW for prisoner of war. To their astonishment, the meals often contained meat, bread, and vegetables, far better than the rations they had been eating in the German army, and certainly better than what civilians back in Germany were surviving on. For many, the disbelief was overwhelming. "We expected chains," one former prisoner recalled, "but instead we were given soup and bread." The psychological contrast was enormous. Soldiers who had steeled themselves for suffering now found themselves sleeping in clean barracks, under roofs that did not leak, with access to medical care if they were sick or injured. Some described it as surreal, almost like waking from a nightmare into a dream. Of course, life as a prisoner was not freedom. There were fences, armed guards, and strict rules. Roll calls were long and exhausting. Any attempt to escape was dealt with severely, though in truth very few tried. Where would they go? The United States was vast, and escape across unfamiliar territory was nearly impossible. Most accepted their fate. They would remain prisoners until the war's end. But even in captivity, many began to realize that life in America was not what they had expected. One of the first shocks came when they were allowed glimpses of American towns during their transfer to camps. As the trains rolled through, they saw grocery stores filled with food, houses untouched by bombs, and cars driving along open roads. Civilians stared at the prisoners through the windows, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with hostility. But what struck the Germans most was the abundance of goods, full shelves, thriving farms, and streets free from rubble. For men who knew their families back home were scraping by with ration cards and fear, this was almost incomprehensible. Arrival at the camps also revealed something else. The Americans intended to follow the Geneva Convention rules closely. Prisoners were not to be tortured or starved. They were given the right to food, shelter, and even recreation. To the Germans, this was shocking. Many had seen or heard how the Nazis treated their own captives. Soviet soldiers left to die of hunger, resistance fighters executed in the streets. They could not believe that their enemies would show them such restraint. Still, suspicion lingered. Some German officers warned the men not to trust the Americans, that it was all a trick, that the kindness would not last. But as weeks turned to months, the routine of life in captivity became clear. They would work, they would be counted, they would be guarded, but they would also live, and living after the chaos of the battlefield was more than many had dared to hope for. What made the deepest impression on the prisoners was not just the lack of chains, but the sense of dignity they were still afforded. They were not treated as equals, but neither were they treated as beasts. For young men raised on Nazi propaganda about America being a land of chaos and cruelty, this was confusing. They had been taught that Americans were weak, decadent, incapable of order. Yet here they were, in the heart of that supposed chaos, being treated with more humanity than they ever imagined. As more transports arrived, the camps swelled with German prisoners. Some felt bitterness, ashamed of their capture. Others felt relief, glad simply to be alive. But nearly all carried the same thought. This is not what we expected. In those first months of arrival, the shock never left them. They had been enemies on the battlefield, soldiers prepared to die for their country. Yet here in America, they were simply men behind fences, alive, fed, and unchained. For the German POWs, the arrival in the United States marked the beginning of an unexpected chapter, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their enemies, their war, and even themselves. For many German prisoners, life inside the American camps was the greatest shock of all. They had braced themselves for cruelty, for hunger, humiliation, even torture. Instead, they found a strange mix of confinement and dignity. There were fences and watchtowers, yes, but behind those fences stood barracks that were clean, organized, and in some ways more comfortable than what they had left behind on the battlefield. The camps themselves were often built in rural parts of America, far from cities, where escape would be nearly impossible. Long wooden barracks stretched across open fields with barbed wire fences enclosing the perimeters. Guard towers stood at the corners, staffed by American soldiers with rifles. Signs marked every boundary, reminding prisoners that beyond the wire, freedom was forbidden. And yet within those fences, life took on a rhythm that surprised them. Each morning began with roll call. The prisoners lined up in formation, counted carefully by the guards. The routine was strict, but it was not brutal. Afterward came breakfast, usually consisting of bread, porridge, and sometimes eggs or meat. For men who had lived on meager rations in the German army, these meals felt almost luxurious. Many wrote in their diaries that they were eating better in captivity than their families were eating back home. The Geneva Convention was carefully observed. Prisoners were entitled to shelter, food, and medical care, and the Americans upheld those rules with discipline. Doctors visited the camps, and those who fell ill were treated in camp infirmaries. Clothing was provided, uniforms marked with the letters PW, short for prisoner of war, but they were warm and durable. Some men joked that they had never been so well fed and clothed as they were in captivity. Daily life was organized around work, though the Americans were careful to assign jobs that did not directly contribute to the war effort. Many prisoners worked inside the camps, maintaining the grounds, cleaning, or cooking. Others were sent to nearby farms or logging camps where their labor was desperately needed. With so many American men overseas fighting, there were not enough workers to harvest crops or chop timber. The German prisoners filled that gap. At first, the idea of working outside the camps under light guard seemed unbelievable. But the system worked. Prisoners were escorted to fields and orchards where they picked fruit, baled hay, or tended to livestock. Farmers often interacted with them directly, sometimes even sharing meals. The Germans were astonished. They were the enemy, and yet here they were, trusted to work in the heart of American communities. Inside the camps, there was also time for leisure. Americans believed that keeping prisoners occupied would reduce tension and unrest. So the camps had libraries stocked with donated books. They had soccer fields and baseball diamonds. Prisoners organized orchestras and theater performances using whatever instruments and materials they could find. Some even built furniture or crafted artworks from scraps of wood. In one camp, prisoners staged entire plays, complete with costumes stitched from old cloth. Education was also encouraged. Prisoners held classes teaching one another languages, mathematics, and history. Some learned English during their captivity, practicing with guards or reading American newspapers. For young men who had left school early to join the army, the camps became, strangely enough, places of learning. Not everything was easy, of course. There was boredom, homesickness, and the constant reminder that they were still captives. Letters from home trickled in, often weeks or months late, filled with news of bombings, shortages, and suffering in Germany. Many prisoners felt guilt, knowing they were eating 3 meals a day while their families struggled to survive on scraps. Others worried about their loved ones, uncertain if they were even still alive. Tension sometimes arose among the prisoners themselves. In certain camps, die-hard Nazis tried to enforce loyalty, threatening or even attacking those they saw as weak or disloyal. Secret tribunals were rumored where men accused of betraying the Reich were beaten. The Americans tried to monitor these activities, but the prisoners often policed themselves, creating invisible lines of fear inside the barracks. Still, for the majority, survival meant adapting quietly to camp life. One of the most striking differences between American camps and the expectations the Germans carried was the absence of chains. In Germany, prisoners of war were often treated harshly, forced into labor camps under brutal conditions. The idea that they could walk unchained to a farm or into a work detail under only the watch of a few guards felt almost surreal. Many admitted later that it changed the way they thought about their captors. Music became a powerful outlet. In the evenings, men would gather with guitars, violins, or harmonicas, playing songs from home. Sometimes the guards listened, even applauded. There are stories of Christmas celebrations where American guards allowed prisoners to light candles and sing carols. In those moments, for a brief time, the war seemed far away. Sports, too, played an important role. Soccer matches drew large crowds within the camps, and baseball, a game foreign to many Germans, became a curiosity. Some even learned to play, laughing as they tried to understand the strange rules. These activities gave structure to their days and reminded them that they were still men, not just prisoners. The work programs, however, were the most transformative. On farms, prisoners interacted with ordinary Americans. They saw families sitting down to dinner, children running through fields, shops filled with goods. For soldiers raised on propaganda that painted America as a land of chaos and poverty, the reality was shocking. One prisoner wrote, "We expected to see misery. Instead, we saw a country full of life. Of course, not every interaction was warm. Some Americans resented the presence of enemy soldiers in their towns. There were angry words, suspicion, and sometimes hostility. Families who had lost sons in the war could not bear the sight of the very men they were fighting against being fed and housed nearby. Yet over time, in many communities, a strange kind of familiarity grew. Farmers came to rely on the prisoners' labor. Shopkeepers sold them goods. Children sometimes watched them work, curious rather than afraid. The contrast between their lives in the camps and the devastation in Germany grew sharper as the war dragged on. News reached them of bombings in Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin. Letters told of hunger, of cold winters without fuel, of families torn apart. Many prisoners felt conflicted, grateful for their treatment in America, but heartsick for their loved ones suffering back home. And yet, despite everything, the prisoners adapted. They built routines. They made friends. They survived. Life in the camps was not freedom, but it was not the nightmare they had expected. It was something else entirely, a strange limbo between war and peace, captivity and dignity. And for many German POWs, it would leave an impression that lasted long after the war was over. When the war ended, the fences finally opened. Trains carried the German prisoners back across the ocean, back to a homeland in ruins. Many returned to find their families gone, their cities destroyed, their country divided. And yet what stayed with them was not only the memory of war, but the unexpected years they had spent in captivity, in a land they had once been told was their enemy. For most of these men, life as a prisoner in America had been unlike anything they imagined. They had walked through towns without chains. They had eaten full meals, played soccer, studied languages, even laughed again. They had seen a side of America that challenged everything Nazi propaganda had told them. Some carried bitterness, ashamed of being captured. But many carried something different: respect, a recognition that even in war, humanity could be shown. And for a surprising number, those memories grew into something more. Decades later, former POWs returned to the United States, not as captives, but as immigrants, seeking the life they had glimpsed through barbed wire. The story of German POWs in America is not just about fences and guards. It is about the clash between expectation and reality, about enemies discovering common ground, and about the power of dignity even in the shadow of war.